Political and cultural issues have divided the university community in recent years. What impact will this have on academia?
I think one thing that happens is students come to a university and it changes them. The experience of living in this kind of community changes them. And then that, in turn, sort of drives some of the reaction.
This is the reason why we have to stand up for free speech that's really offensive, because what offends you may be different than what offends someone else.
That's next on Seattle University Conversations. Now your host, Joni Balter.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Seattle University's Spring Conversation program. Our guests today are University of Washington President Joni Cauce and Seattle University's own President, Eduardo Peñalver. Thank you both for being here. You've been a little busy lately, just a teeny bit. Seated next to me is Abigail Berhane. She is a newly minted Seattle University graduate, and she is headed for Georgetown University Graduate School a couple months from now, and she's going to be studying global politics and security. Abigail joins me in conducting today's interview. Thank you very much for that. President Cauce, we start with you. Since we are discussing political polarization and its impacts on universities, what are the broad challenges of leading universities in such a polarized climate as the one we face today?
Well, one of the biggest challenges that we have that's unique to being a public university that partly intersects and partly doesn't with that is the whole issue of resources. For example, at the University of Washington, we still are getting less state investment than we were before the recession. So we're getting less now than we were 15 years ago. And together with that, though, we are then also constrained in a number of ways. We are constrained in terms of what we can charge for tuition, even for our high-income students. But also, for example, we cannot, like Columbia and Dartmouth and, NYU, et cetera, we can't close off our campus. We can't gate our campus, so it's only our students in our campus. And so, we have, on the one hand, these incredible responsibilities that come from being a state university, including the fact that demand is going through the roof, but at the same time, not the resources that we need to do them. And like I say, in a politically polarized climate, that is particularly difficult because the responsibilities are greater. I think then the other thing that I think that we share, whether we're public or private, is that, universities are quickly losing the public's confidence. And it's for different reasons. On the more conservative end, it is about the polarization and the fact that they believe that we lean too liberal. And then on the more liberal end, it really is about cost and the feeling that we charge too much and our students come. And so it's hard enough to deal with the fact that there's losing confidence in our universities, but they're for different reasons, and so you're constantly trying to balance them.
I think you've touched on almost every question that we have to come, so we're going to come back to some of those. Yes. President Peñalver, the same question. What are your challenges in managing a university in today's polarized climate?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting us, and it's a great topic to be thinking about and talking about right now, and has been for a while. I think about it, and I'll just talk about this in general terms, right, rather than necessarily the challenges we experience here, but
yeah, we want to keep this at 30,000 feet. Is much of the goal here today?
But you can think of it through, I think, three different dimensions, right? So polarization on campus, and then polarization off campus, and then the other way is maybe polarization at the campus or kind of directed at the campus. So, which is a sort of manifestation of the second one, right? But polarization on campus, and this is going to affect different universities differently. I think becomes harder to just sort of hold the community together when we have a broader range of perspectives at the faculty, on the student body, and the staff, and so whatever is happening in the broader society is going to have an impact on the nature of discourse on the campus. And that's, as polarization increases, that does touch university life. So at Cornell, being in the middle of upstate New York, there was a heavy kind of Trump influence on the staff side, right? Because the staff were drawn from that region of the state. Often, it depended on the kind of staff, right? And then the faculty tend to lean left, right? And so you'd get people, different things landing differently on the campus based on what role you occupied.
If I might elaborate on this a little bit, because this is something that I've studied a bit in terms of our campuses. There's this perception out there that somehow, our students, aren't rough enough and that they've been coddled and so forth and so on. We've all read about this. But the truth is that the diversity that we have managed to bring onto campus, the fact that we have more students of color, that we have more first-generation students, that we have this diversity on campuses at the same time that our society has become, in fact, more cocooned. Our neighborhoods are less diverse than they used to be because they've become more segregated by income. And so you have students coming here that really have had a huge difference in experiences coming together in a way that didn't used to be the case. The example I give, since we both went to Yale, Yale was the first time that I left home. So I lived in graduate students' dorms. And the dorm that I was in had 2 rooms that shared 1 bathroom. One room was larger, still small, but larger. It had a fireplace, it had a window seat. The other room was very barren. Why? The reason that those rooms were that way is it used to be a student who brought their valet. So the fact that we didn't have this kind of polarization.
Maybe a little design work coming to Yale.
Exactly. I mean, well, what I'm saying is talk about coddled.
Yeah.
That it really is now compared to 20 years ago, 50 years ago, et cetera. We have more diversity on campus. That's a wonderful thing. But then managing that in terms of the different perspectives, which are very passionate, that come out of lived experiences, does create some more difficulties.
Yeah, thank you so much. President Cauce, what do you make of the trend these days towards more people feeling that colleges are not as essential as previously thought? What is the best way to make universities a more universally recognized value?
Well, I want to start off by saying that I actually think it's a very positive thing that some of our professions that don't require college degrees are paying better. And I do think it's important to make sure that, for me, it's all about making sure that there's choice. And a lot of why students aren't going to college is because they think that it is unaffordable. And sometimes those students that all of us know would get all the financial aid in the world are the ones who know it least. I think in terms of my own family, my brother started off at community college because my family thought that was all we could afford, when in fact, when one of his teachers started talking to him, it was cheaper for him to go to university because of all the financial aid. So that, I think, is a big part of it. Also, I think that sometimes, and this is not, surprising, we think about short run rather than long run. So the idea of taking a loan, even a small loan, or not, of not getting a job, at this moment seems so important, and you're not thinking about 10 years down the line. The truth is that college is a great investment. And this state in particular has great financial aid. And I think what we have to do is, how do we amplify that message? And that's why I'm really glad to be here, is we need to amplify the message that in this state, things really are affordable, and the payoff of going to college will last throughout a lifetime, both in terms of income, but also in the ability to be engaged citizens, which is so important.
Well, and even the fact of this question, right, is a reflection of the polarization that you asked about at the outset, right? That the polarization directed at universities, right? There's because we're polarized, and because we're polarized, not just ideologically, right, but the ideology corresponds very strongly with educational attainment, right? And so educational attainment is very predictive of political behavior. There's a one side of the political spectrum is very motivated to be constantly attacking higher education for political reasons, and looking at the return on investment as one way that they do that. And yet the data is very clear, right? That actually the return on a university education has increased over time, is continuing to increase.
Yeah, I also think one thing that both Seattle U, because of its mission, its Jesuit mission, and the University of Washington, because of its public mission, does well, is we care a lot about community engagement. And I think in too many communities, they hesitate to send their children to college because they feel it will pull them out of their community. And what we're trying to do is make sure that with their degrees, they can better serve their communities.
Yeah. I know you both just touched on this, but one reason college seemed less approachable is, again, the rising cost, with some charging as much as $95,000 a year. In my own experience, this year I had a choice between Columbia and Georgetown grad schools, and price drove my decision. Let's face it, colleges charge too much. What does that add to the polarization? Again, just highlighting.
Well, again, I think that, it's important to look at net price. I do think that there are some places that, quite frankly, people have written about it. Steve Sample, who used to be at USC, wrote about this openly, that what you wanted to do is raise the price and then raise the financial aid, and so people would think they were getting a big deal. And I think that that is a rather cynical strategy. But I think that, again, you need to look at what the real price is. At a public university like ours, I go to meetings all the time and I ask them, how much do you think our tuition is? And almost everyone thinks it's over $25,000 a year. It's closer to $12,000 a year. But the truth is that even middle-income students are getting financial aid, and all our moderate to low-income students don't pay any tuition. And on top of that, it's not just that they don't pay any tuition, but we help towards the cost of living, which at our university, the cost of living is higher than the cost of tuition. So I do think that there probably are some places that are a bit cynical in terms of where they set their tuition, because, if you look at the discount rate, it's huge. But I do think that part of it is that people don't have the information. And of course, cost is going to drive it. It drove the decision for me, both as undergraduate and as a graduate student.
Yeah, it's a tough question. And I would distinguish between undergraduate and graduate and professional education as well. But at the undergraduate level, you do have these very high discount rates, and it leads to this opacity, which I think is a problem, right? It deters people from even seeking out their options. But on the other hand, it does generate really important redistribution within the student body, right? So parents, really affluent parents, can pay full tuition, and then that in part funds financial aid for students from lower income backgrounds. And so there's a reason for it, but it is a real challenge in terms of how you communicate to prospective students that they should, take the plunge. And the reality is, if you look at, especially at the undergraduate level, over the last decade, the cost has not increased, right? Because even as tuition has increased, the discount rate has increased just as fast, and in some cases even faster.
I think that, what President Peñalver just said about opacity is huge. And so, for example, we and a number of other universities have a financial aid calculator right on an admissions page, which won't tell you, but gives you a pretty good sense of what you'll be paying, so that you know that in advance.
I think folks hear so much about the burden of student loans that they don't realize that sometimes, you are going to have a loan, but sometimes you're going to get more of a grant, right? Isn't it? That's
more than 60% of our students graduate with no known debt, and the average known debt is just a little over $20,000 a year at the bachelor's level.
And for private colleges?
Yeah, I think our grant aid, our typical grant aid is exceeding $20,000 a student for undergraduates, and I think again, graduate and professional school is different, and student debt is a mixed bag, right? I funded my entire way through law school with student loans, and that opened to me the opportunity to be a lawyer, and I wouldn't, right? And I was able to go and work as a lawyer and service that debt, and my dad paid for his whole medical school through loans and finished paying off his loans the year my sister started college. So
taking on her loans.
So, I mean, student loans are a great vehicle of opportunity as well. And I think that the question is, and what we need to make sure we're doing, is providing people with good information so that they can make informed choices about how this is going to impact their lives. We don't want students, especially coming out of undergraduate education, stacked up with debt, because then that's going to limit their opportunities in terms of graduate and professional education. But especially for professional education that opens the doors to high-income jobs, I think loans are a perfectly reasonable approach.
One of the things that I've been really pushing for, and a lot of us have been really pushing for, is loan repayment programs. So, for example, nurses, that if they go into public service, their loans, over a 10-year period, their loan will be repaid. Or again, if you're going into medical schools in high-need areas, in rural areas, and low-income areas, if you're going into public law and you're a public defender. On the other hand, if you're going to work for a private law firm, you should pay back your loans.
Yeah. The public service loan forgiveness program is amazing.
Yeah.
And if you work in a public interest job, 10 years, make your payments, your loans are forgiven.
So, President Peñalver, we spoke a few minutes ago about the impact of a politically polarized environment upon colleges. And I wasn't sure when you mentioned the three layers of this. Do colleges themselves contribute to the polarized environment? And if so, how?
It's an interesting question. I don't think colleges are the main driver of the polarization. Although I will say that I think there's
this current moment has some polarizing impact, right?
Certainly, yeah. But I think that's more kind of reflecting what's going on back at society than necessarily driving that polarization. I will say though, I think that one of the reasons colleges are a target of so much political animus is something that President Cauce pointed to, which is the diversity of university communities. And when you look across our societies, universities are the most diverse communities that exist, right? I mean, there's nothing like a university community, both in terms of generational diversity, but also racial, economic, not every university, right, but racial, economic, gender, identity diversity. And so you'd be hard pressed to find geographic communities in the United States that have that, right? And so I think one thing that happens is students come to a university and it changes them. The experience of living in this kind of community changes them. And then that in turn sort of drives some of the reaction, because some people don't like the change that a university education works on students.
Yeah, I think that, regardless of whether universities add to that polarization or not, I think we do have a responsibility to try and educate, to educate our students to be able to work across it. And I think it's been incredibly difficult right now because we're dealing with some issues that are incredibly complicated, where there's a lot of passion. And for example, our Jackson School put together a lecture series where we really did have a range of perspectives. I've been criticized both for platforming Zionists and for having pro-Hamas speakers.
I like the voice you go to.
That's exactly what those emails sounded like to me. And, I figured that must mean we got something right, everyone.
Well, if everyone's mad for us journalists, we have succeeded.
Yeah, sometimes. And now we have an Islamophobia and anti-Semitism task force. And I think among the things that they're going to suggest is that we include those topics in some of our DEI training when students come into the university. And I think that makes sense. They'll probably find. But I think that we do need to find, and we are struggling to find them. And I can say we are not at the success where I think where I would like us to be, to how can we find ways, and we've been talking a lot about that, how can we find ways to really create dialogue across differences? And I think it's our responsibility to find those ways. We're working on it. We're not where I think we need to be.
Well, you had one of the noisier or more challenging speakers at the University of Washington just last week, right?
Yes, we did.
And how did that go?
Well, There was no serious injuries, which we feel very, very good about. But it was difficult because I think what we're seeing, and that's the hard part, is that people are speaking just to their audience. And rather than trying to, again, speak across differences and see where there might be some common ground. And surprisingly, I do think that there's places of common ground. I believe strongly in free speech, and it was important that we had that speaker.
Yeah, I think that does point to one way that, and I don't want to kind of tar all universities with this, right? But that some universities have contributed to at least polarization about higher education. I don't say polarization broadly, right? But we all know the anecdotes of universities that have failed to protect freedom of speech, and it's been, for the most part, it's been the freedom of speech of political conservatives, right? So think of the speaker at MIT, the climate scientist who was going to give a talk on climate science, whose talk was canceled because of op-eds he had written about affirmative action, which had nothing to do with the speech he was going to be delivering at MIT. That, and of course, then there's a whole media industry that's sort of built up to magnify those stories and make sure everyone hears about them. We don't hear about the speakers that don't get disrupted and the speakers that are allowed onto campus. We hear about the ones that are canceled. But those are own goals, right? Those are ways that we've harmed the standing of universities and contributed to polarization about higher education.
And I think that, just to echo, I think that that's really important, that there's this sense out there, and there's at least a grain of truth in it, that all of a sudden some people have discovered freedom of speech. And that in some cases, these were folks who were arguing against freedom of speech not that long ago. What I can say very clearly about us at the University of Washington is that we had Milo Yiannopoulos. We allowed our students to do a build a wall that was really incredibly difficult for someone like me who's an immigrant. We had an affirmative action bake sale that was incredibly insulting to our students. So it's not like we've discovered free speech now. We really need, and exactly this is the reason why we have to stand up for free speech that's really offensive, because what offends you may be different than what offends someone else.
Yeah, I think the public universities have done better on this. This has been a phenomenon of private universities because we're not constrained by the First Amendment. We determine what academic freedom is, what the boundaries of discourse are on our campuses, right? And so it's that there's been a little bit of.
And I want to come back to that, but I think
President Peñalver, how does the social media contribute to the polarization that colleges are currently dealing with? So.
Yeah, it's very hard to ignore the impact of social media, and I think it's these three dimensions, right? It's the polarization on campus, polarization off campus, and then the way that interacts with what's happening on campus. Social media, I think, really has had an impact of causing our ability to disagree constructively to atrophy. Because we just don't build those muscles anymore. We tend to, the algorithms are designed to either keep us kind of focused on people we agree with or expose us to the most outrageous versions of the things we disagree with. They're designed to provoke strong
social media
reactions.
is such a short amount of space to say sometimes the nastiest thing some person can think of.
It incentivizes that, right?
Yes,
and so
it does, and the anonymity.
And that has an impact on how discourse goes on campus, right? And then also anything that happens on campus then gets thrown out into social media in a way that some little incident that could have been managed in a really kind of reparative way before the rise of social media now becomes viral and brings in all these outside forces onto the campus and distorts the university response. So social media is a real challenge for.
I think even one thing that sometimes we forget too is it creates a bubble. So for example, if I read this kind of news, everything else that comes through my feed is from that. I was having a disagreement with a friend, or we were having a conversation with a friend who, this was around a particular COVID drug that had been found to not work. And,
Well, you didn't take the, no, I'm just.
This was, let's, but in any case, what was really interesting is this friend went out and did a web search. And she came up with, a number of websites that looked very real. So that even if you are trying to look further, that it creates a bubble, and that there was, you choose the news that you watch, And so all what you already believe just gets reinforced and reinforced and reinforced.
And there's a good research on this that when you are engaged in that way with people who think like you, and that's who you primarily engage with, it increases your extremism in support of that view, right? Whatever that view is. That
reaffirming.
It
yes.
kind of reaffirms and takes you kind of further to the extreme of that perspective, where when you engage with people who disagree with you, it causes you to sort of question your own views a little more, and it resists extremism. And so social media, to the extent that it separates us into groups of people who agree with one another, is going to drive polarization, and it does it very effectively.
President Peñalver, a survey last week of 1,250 college students nationwide by something called Generation Lab, I've seen other surveys on this as well, show a majority of students rate healthcare, education funding, inflation, and the economy as top issues for students, well ahead of the Mideast, I think ranked 13th among students' top priorities. How do you ensure that protesters' needs, sort of the loudest voices sometimes, don't overwhelm the interests of other students?
I mean, I think it's all. This is not a new challenge, right? I mean, to me, it's the challenge of higher education administration generally. When I became a dean, someone told me, you spend 90% of your time on, the 10% of the community that's the most agitated, and the key is to sort of you need to do that, right? You need to work with people who are agitated, but you also need to keep your eye on the ball of the other 90% and make sure the work of the university is continuing to move forward. And I just think it's just the juggling act, and it's particularly challenging right now, but it's always part of the challenge.
I think that's the case on a range of topics, not just this topic, but certainly,
Understood.
I mean, it's no secret, if you've been watching TV or whatever, we have a liberated zone or an encampment, depending on how you'd like to talk about it, on our campus. And, and people have been thinking that, it's taken over everything. And it was interesting. I took a walk through campus the other day, and our law school was having a beach day, and they were giving out free popsicles, and people were dressed in, in beach clothes. And we had a bunch of school children that were coming to watch a play at the Meany, and there was a concert on the lawn. And, most students were going about their lives and enjoying the sun and not necessarily concerned with what was going on the quad. What we are, of course, concerned about at this point, because we have had two incidences this week that have been extremely concerning, is that when does that start encroaching on the ability of our other students to focus on those things that they care about the most?
Yeah.
Some critics of universities, and this question's coming because you've addressed it at least once or twice here, say we are creating a generation of elitists or snowflakes or both. Have we coddled, and you use that word, students too much with trigger alerts and safe spaces?
I think that we can always come up with a particular incident, a particular situation, or a particular anecdote that's gone too far. But for example, in terms of trigger warnings, I taught an abnormal psychology class for years, and I found after the first couple of times that I taught it that there were always students who believed that they were mentally ill after, and so I always started the class by saying, as you read this material, you're probably going to find yourself in these various diagnoses. If you find a little bit of yourself in all of them, you're probably fine. If only one of you suits you, please come and talk to me, and we'll talk about a referral. You could have called that a trigger warning. I was doing that well before we had such things as trigger warnings. I do think that trying to find a way to be respectful to differences in your classes. We now know an alarming number of women have had some encounters where sexual abuse. It's incredibly large. So if you are going to be dealing with a book with that kind of material, giving a little bit of advance, this material might be difficult for some people. What you see often is it gets parroted as this kind of really strange thing. The truth is that on the one hand, we have a lot more understanding of how to be trauma-informed, et cetera, than we used to be. But the bottom line is our students is probably the less coddled generation that we have ever had, because we have low-income students, because we have students that before, for example, let's say students with mental health problems. Many of these students wouldn't make it onto our campuses before, but because of better services in elementary schools and high schools and better counseling, they are making it on. There are students with disabilities that didn't used to make it on our campuses that now are making it onto our campuses. This is the least coddled generation that I can think of.
Yeah. Just moving a little bit forward, colleges and universities are under increased scrutiny from Congress. What's the impact of Congress calling college presidents before them to question them about campus activities? How does that help or hurt this current situation?
Well, I don't think it's a question of calling college presidents to Congress. We have often testified in Congress about a number of things. It is the way that it has been done.
But it's also about how you folks are conducting yourselves. It's very pointed. It's not about an issue. It's about your own conduct as presidents.
But it's also coming from a very clear perspective. Anyone who listens to these, it's clear that a number of people are coming in already with the intention not of really having an open conversation, but of looking for that gotcha moment. Again, whether it's coincidence or not, the first set of people that were brought up were not just that they were all women, but they'd all been at their universities for less than 2 years. So they were particularly new to the job and having to answer for decisions that were really made by other folks.
Well, and I think it's telling, right, that you had these two sets of testimonies, and the first group took one approach, which was a very lawyerly approach to answering these questions.
Not that there's anything wrong with it.
Nothing wrong with being lawyerly. Very balanced, right? And they got attacked for how when they were asked to chanting from the river to the sea is a violation of their speech codes, and they gave an appropriately nuanced response, and the Congresswoman called for their resignation. And then, I think when the president of Columbia was called, she saw what had happened. She took the opposite approach, and the next day the Congresswoman was calling for her resignation. So that was truly a no-win.
Well, you're the lawyer on the stage here. Do you folks have to testify?
No, you don't.
Should you?
No.
Please help us.
That was someone asked me after the first set of testimony what was their biggest mistake, and I said going. Right? I mean, unless someone brings a subpoena. Why would you go? It was clearly a setup.
Although I have to admit that the public school teachers that testified did a much better job.
Oh.
It's true.
I missed that one. I didn't see that.
I think that part of what they did was that they questioned the premise. And that's where I think that things kind of went off. That, one thing is not going at all, but another thing is if you go, this is not a court of law, and you don't have to answer every question exactly as it's asked. And when a question is a got you,
couldn't you just say, and I think somebody did this at the very beginning, couldn't you just say, I have an appointment that day, or I have a doctor's appointment,
yes.
or I have, some other panel
or I just choose not to come.
Or I'm not, yeah.
Bring me a subpoena. Yeah. You don't have to go. You don't have to go. It was totally voluntary. And I can imagine the conversations, because when that invitation comes, not to pick on the marketing communications people, but they're like, oh, this is a great opportunity to elevate the reputation.
They want you
of
out. They want you in public.
That was one that I think you could have taken a pass on.
But it did seem, at least from the outside, and again, I don't want to criticize my colleagues. I don't know what kind of pressures they were under, et cetera. And like I say, they were very new presidents, including the Columbia president. They'd all been there for less than 2 years.
But would have it gone any different if they were 5-year presidents?
I actually think so.
Really?
I think just because you have more experience with that kind of gotcha moments and how to deal with them. But they were prepared as if this were, they were testifying in front of a court of law. And that was the way that their answers came across, and it wasn't. This was really about the public.
President Peñalver, you have to wonder, and you touched on this, this is about confidence in higher ed. The number of Republicans, so I'm pulling out a group here, expressing a lot of confidence in higher ed plummeted to 19% last year, down from 56% 8 years prior, largely because of cost, as you talked about, but also due to a belief that universities, and this are pushing some kind of political agenda.
Yeah, there's a polarization in the loss of trust. So people on the political left have also seen a decline in trust in higher ed. It's not as dramatic as conservatives, but that's the group that's been more focused on cost, and I would say conservatives have been more focused on ideology. And I think, some of that is reflecting a bit of a reality, right? That there are, the data shows there are, this varies regionally and it varies by kind of institution, but fewer conservatives on campus, right? So there are fewer conservative faculty, fewer conservative students, and so it's perceived as a less friendly place for conservatives, right? So there's a reality there. Some of it is this kind of feedback loop that we've gotten into now, right? Where the conservative media is attacking higher education relentlessly. Any negative story will get blown out over conservative media, and so if you're a conservative and you're looking at that, you think, that's not for me. And then you see, like just the other day, a group of conservative judges said, we're not going to hire anyone who graduates from Columbia Law School. Now, I know how conservative judges hire, and they tend to hire conservative law students. So what that means is, if you're a conservative law student who went to Columbia Law School, I'm not going to hire you. So that is going to further deter conservatives from going to Columbia Law School. So there are these sort of feedback loops that have set in.
Loop. That is absolutely a loop.
Yeah, I think we need to look at two things. One is there's been a real change in who identifies as being conservative. This is, the Goldwater conservatives, if you want to think about that, tended to be more high income. Now we are really dealing with a different level. And I do think that we bear some responsibility. I want to be clear. I think we should be doing much more outreach to low-income students in rural environments. We've been doing that through, for example, our RIDE program in medicine, and we've been doing more and more of that, but I think we need to do even more. We are now at a point where nationally, it's almost 60% of college students are women. There's a male problem.
I've seen it in the classrooms. at
the UW, it isn't anywhere near that way, but it's real. And so, for example, we have a brotherhood initiative that is largely for men of color, but also includes low-income students. We need to, I do think that we need to look at diversity more broadly and really look at some sectors that we haven't traditionally been doing outreach to.
Yeah. President Cauce, first I'll quote from an article you wrote in March. Far from retreating from the fray at this pivotal moment for our country and the world, those of us in positions of leadership at major universities need to ask not whether but how our universities can best play a role in meeting the urgency of this moment and the challenge to come. In general, should universities take side in the events of the day, and what are the requirements if they do take a stand?
Well, I think that, that there is, folks may be aware of the Calvin principles that are out there. And I don't think it's...
Can you explain the Calvin?
The Calvin principles came out of University of Chicago, and they basically... If you just, read them superficially, what they seem to say is that universities should be neutral on political positions, because if they're not, they quelch free speech. Truth is that they're more nuanced than that, and in fact, the son of Calvin says that too many presidents are using them as a shield to not have to say anything. So, but in any case, I'm going to talk less about the Calvin principles than the way they've been used, which is that we should stay out of the fray. I think we need to be very careful about how we get involved in the fray, and we need to be careful that when we do make statements that we are not silencing, and there's different ways that one can do that. But, look, almost any topic can be politicized. Should we not be involved in seeking solutions to the climate problems? Because some people say that, they're not man-made. Should we? I think it is absolutely critical, but I do think that the issue is how do we do it in a way that does listen to the diversity of voices and that doesn't silence?
Yeah. President Peñalver, I read in an article you wrote in May of 2023 discussing free speech. How neutral should universities, including Seattle University, be on issues like the war in Gaza right now?
So I would distinguish between neutrality as a kind of substantive value and weighing in or making statements. I think those are two different questions, right? So I agree that the Calvin Commission's or committee's report, I think, lends itself to this very strong account of neutrality, right? That universities should not take positions at all, and that's a broad claim, right? Because that means you take a position through giving a statement, but you can also take a position by taking an action. And we take actions all the time on things that are controversial. So the examples I've given are, climate change. We're trying to be a carbon neutral campus, and we've divested from fossil fuels. Those are actions that we've taken that take a position on climate change, right? That's different than silencing people who disagree with us or just making empty statements about climate change. We take action. Affirmative action, right? Politically controversial. We have staked out a position on the importance of diversity and the relevance of taking race into account in order to achieve a kind of diversity that we want to achieve on our campus, and certainly before the Supreme Court and changed the law on that. So, you can take a position. I think it's impossible for universities to be neutral. The question of whether to issue a statement is a different one, and that's one where I've taken a very parsimonious approach, because I think for two reasons. One is statements don't accomplish anything except maybe stake out an orthodoxy and silence people who disagree. And also there's been a kind of inflationary economy of statement making over the last 10 years where universities were expected to make more and more statements. And so then when you don't make a statement, people infer you don't care. And
silence means something, right?
Yeah, silence, so you have to be really cautious about when you weigh in. And the line I've drawn is I weigh in on things that relate to things that we're doing, that relate to Seattle University, rather than weighing in just in an abstract way about events in the world. Because in part because of the wrongness of doing that in any given instance in terms of who it silences, but also the precedent it sets for the next one and the next one and the next one.
Yeah, I think it is really important to have, for people to sit down and have clear policies about when. I do think that often world problems do end up affecting people in our university very closely. One of our recent graduates was killed during the Hamas attack. It hit very close to home. In natural disasters, we have some that really affect a lot of our students. Hawaii, because we have a large, and then there are others that don't affect that many, and all of those things go into thinking about, do we say something or not?
Yeah. Actually, in an announcement from your office last Friday, you said you thought official statements can be empty gestures. Actions matter more. So can you please tell us how that is playing a part right now at Seattle University?
Well, I'll use the example from that communication, right? Because we've had calls from segments of our student body and others to evaluate our relationship with Boeing, or to evaluate our endowment investments in relation to the conflict in Israel and Gaza, right? To divesting the endowment, as we did with fossil fuels. And so what I said we would do in that statement is we will set up we'll have meetings, and we'll bring leaders from the board. These are board issues, whether and how we invest ultimately are board decisions. So we're going to bring together the leader of the investment committee of our board, the CFO who's responsible for that relationship, and the outside company that manages our investments, Cambridge Associates, and look at what if you ask me today, are we invested in anything related to Israel? I can't tell you the answer, because it changes day to day, and we don't have a policy against it, right? But I don't know exactly what's in our endowment at any given moment. So we'll look at it, and then we'll have further conversations. We've set the precedent, right, with climate change of using the endowment as a vehicle for university policy. There's a risk in terms of taking that too far, right? How many different limitations can we put around our investment managers? But, once we're down that road, I think it's only consistent to at least entertain the conversation. So that's an action, right? And so that's why I made the statement. that I made last week. Look, here's the actions we're taking. Here are the things that we can do. But I again said I'm not going to issue a statement kind of laying out an official university position on a really complex issue of international relations. It's not. I don't feel qualified to do it, and I don't think it accomplishes anything for the university.
Could you reach, because we've talked a little bit about the differences between public and private universities, but can you just like quickly note what you can do and not do, and what you can do and what you can't do, or however that goes? Just because there are differences as we're dealing with all this polarization.
Well, it's I mean, I'm sure I can't come up with a full list, but for example, our investments are all transparent. And students have made, they were making FOIA requests, and I said, we can give this to you. I mean, give us a list of the companies we should look at, and we can tell you. It's not, that there's nothing behind, that it is.
FOIA requests take forever, is the
right.
is
but
the
I'm
new
saying that, we said you don't have. But I'm saying you don't have to, we can give that to you.
Yeah.
And we did have some students meet with one of the folks who manages our endowment portfolio. And as it turns out, we actually have no investments in weapon companies, and we have no investments in companies that are cited in Israel. Direct investments. There's the indirect investments, index funds and managers, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So what I'm saying is that we have a level of transparencies that might take a while, but that all our faculty salaries are out there. If I give someone a raise, it is clear my salary. Everyone knows what it is. So there's a transparency. There's also one other thing that's very different is, like I say, our university. Inside the classrooms, I have some control, but in terms of whether it's Red Square or the Quad, et cetera, anybody can come, and on any given day, we have people out there that are doing things that some group or other would find offensive, whether it's pictures of, dead fetuses, or whether we have someone out there that is, we've had some, no question, some groups coming down and doing protests against the Middle East using slogans that have been incredibly offensive and in some cases blatantly anti-Semitic, like we don't want no Zionists here. And, we need to allow that. We need to
sent to English class, no?
We need to, allow. And so that is required. We can't close our campus in any way, shape, or form.
Are there a few that...
I think those are the key differences. I mean, we have more discretion about the scope of speech that we allow on our campus. That said, we've made a choice as an academic institution to robustly protect academic freedom and freedom of speech. So, but the real where the difference really has teeth is with respect to outside groups. So we don't have to rent out our facilities to, Giannopoulos or whatever, Iannopoulos, whatever his name was. Some incendiary speaker. We don't have to create access for that on our campus, and we generally yoke our protection of speech and academic freedom to our educational mission.
President Cauce, how does the ongoing debate over academic freedom, freedom of speech, and democracy impact the standing of universities as respected institutions, particularly in light of recent events?
Well, I think it is really, what's been interesting has been watching how the shape of those have changed. Not that long ago, you would have heard a lot of students and faculty saying they needed to ban hate speech, and now all of a sudden, that's less of an issue. And so we've seen them evolve, which is exactly why I think that I think it is absolutely critical that we have free speech and that we have academic freedom. There will be always, those moments when, right at the edge, we can have some debates, but I think that they're absolutely important, and I think that the moment that we're experiencing now really brings home for some people exactly why it is that important to do that. Having said that, I think that it also, and that's what's difficult about campuses, is that even though some things are free speech, it doesn't mean that students that it doesn't actually hurt students. I can tell you the Build the Wall was particularly difficult for me as an immigrant to this country. But I think that as universities, we focused a lot on being safe spaces. Safe spaces are important, but so are brave spaces. How do we teach our students to deal with the fact that, guess what, no matter who they are, there's someone out there that doesn't like them?
Yeah. President Peñalver, do you believe that the current downward reputational trajectory of prominent American universities historically entrusted with shaping the nation's future citizens independent from political influence poses a threat to future democracy?
Sorry, I didn't get the first. There was a word in the beginning of the question that I didn't.
Do you believe that the current downward reputational?
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think it. I mean, I think that universities play an essential role in educating the leadership of our country, the civic leadership of our country. Right. Our mission statement at Seattle University calls on us to empower leaders, right, for a just and humane world. So it's really, if you think about how have we defined the core of our educational mission? It's educating leaders, and a key part of that is learning to engage with people who think differently from you. It's developing the ability to understand complex issues and engage on them to understand the complexity of the issues, right? But the downward reputation of higher education means that over time, our ability to attract potential future leaders and the breadth of potential future leaders that we need to be educating is going to decline. And the faith that people have in the leaders we're producing is going to decline. So we need to find a way to engage constructively with the broader society about what higher education is, what it's not, and to try to reverse. I mean, I think it's a real problem that trust in higher education is declining as rapidly as it is. We need to find a way to reverse that decline.
Yeah, I think that it's really, that the moment and the complexity of our society require more education to be informed citizens rather than less. We focus a lot on the importance of more education for the workforce, and that's incredibly important. But it's there for democracy. For example, if you're going to be a good juror, you better understand DNA, because they will bring in DNA evidence. And if you don't understand what that is, you're not going to be a good juror. Anybody needs to begin, we have a Center for the Informed Public that's trying to train people to how do you read through social media? How do you ask the right questions? AI is going to make that even more important. So there is no question that universities play an incredibly important role, and we need our citizenry to be more educated, not less.
Sign of the times, and this is for either of you. Are you hiring K Street PR firms to lobby Congress on your behalf? According to Politico, many universities, dozens of them, I think you're going to get a knock on the door pretty soon here, are hearing from these firms because they're saying, how are we going to be better connected in Washington, D.C.? How are we going to burnish our image? Are you doing that, or what do you think of that?
We are not.
Neither are we.
We do not have lobbyists.
Okay, well then what other steps are you folks taking to kind of get at what you were saying a moment ago, President Peñalver, to raise up the image, the confidence of universities?
Well, I like what President Cauce said about community engagement. I think starting locally is really important, and making sure that we're engaging constructively with the communities around Seattle University and with the city of Seattle and the political community that we're a part of. And I think we do that really well. We can always look for new ways to do it, think of new ways we can serve the community. And actually this forum is a great example of that. And we like to talk about Seattle University as a kind of living room for the city to come and discuss and debate, making sure that we're providing an atmosphere where that can happen, and that we're addressing topics that are salient and useful to the community. So we just had last week continuing education that was run for several hundred criminal justice professionals that's run by our Department of Criminal Justice and Forensics. And so, there all kinds of things like that we can do. The Center for Community Engagement, which works extensively in the neighborhoods around Seattle University, is another example. So I think that's a way that we can really build our reputation locally, and then that's the foundation. And I think if every university attended to that reputation locally, we'd be in better shape.
Yeah, so I'm quickly running out of time, and I want to get one question in, and then Abigail has the last question for us today, and we've got to go quick here. President Biden has said, and everybody knows this, there has been a ferocious surge of anti-Semitism on college campuses throughout the country. Is it an understatement to say this is a teachable moment?
That is absolutely not an understatement. It is absolutely a very real issue across our society. To think that our campuses are immune to it, I've got to say that last night, and we had a lot of people from outside the university on our campus, some of the graffiti was absolutely abhorrent and very clearly anti-Semitic. There's no question. I don't think it was our students, but nonetheless, it's on our campus, and we need to deal with that, and that's part of why we have an anti-Semitism task force.
President Peñalver, is activism part of the education process? Is it activism?
I think it's definitely, activism is a part of the educational experience, and it's a long tradition on university campuses, and it's something that was part of my educational experience for sure. And you learn important skills by engaging in student activism or other kinds of activism. So I do think it's an important part of the educational process. I think most universities make space for it and welcome it, but also because it's an educational experience, I think we need to guide it and make sure that it's actually an educational experience, that it advance our students' understanding of the world and their impact on the world, right? And so we have a responsibility to allow it and to kind of create space for it, but also to guide it in some respects.
So 20 seconds. Did you want to add to that?
No, there is no question that, activism is an important part of life. And, we want our students to be socially engaged, to be civically engaged. There's no question about that. But I think that what it's our responsibility to try and do is, how do you get them to do that in a way that's constructive and that's actually going to lead to change rather than to more division? And how do you do it that it's a way that is constructive, where my activism, my free speech rights don't interfere with yours?
So we are out of time. Hearty thanks to the presidents of Seattle University and the University of Washington. Thanks to this wonderful, respectful audience, and thanks to all of you for watching.